Hi, my name is Ravi Jagannathan. I'm from Juniper Networks. Today I want to talk about how OpenStack can help IoT, particularly with respect to security. IoT is an emerging technology, as we all know, and virtualization is about 10 years old, and IoT is emerging, and I think it's definitely, if OpenStack can accommodate IoT, I think it'll be a major boost for OpenStack. Security is the main impediment for deploying IoT devices in the field in a large scale. As such, we have seen several security breaches, and IoT is a vulnerable device in that aspect. OpenStack currently does not support IoT in general, but even if one wants to adopt, it is not adopting or helping IoT in security at all. I'll just go through some aspects of that. So this talk points to some areas where OpenStack can actually help IoT, so it'll be beneficial to OpenStack and it'll also be beneficial to IoT. So OSAP guys did a lot of study on IoT devices, and they actually, here are the top 10 concerns they have with respect to IoT security. Number one is insecure web interface, insufficient authentication and authorization, which is very important for IoT devices. And insecure network services, that is another aspect where IoT devices suffer. Lack of transport encryption. This is also an area where not all IoT devices can do equal justice because they are varied kind of IoT devices. There are privacy concerns and insecure cloud interface, insecure mobile interface, and insufficient security configurability, which is one of the issues in IoT devices, insecure software and firmware, and also physical security that are associated with IoT devices. OpenStack cannot help in all aspects. However, it can help in some aspects, like authentication. Authentication is already OpenStack does some kind of an authentication for the users, and authorization with respect to administrators. So it can actually help IoT with respect to that. Another thing is IoT devices are so varied in nature. Some devices could be they could be passive, or they could be limited in the kind of encryptions they could do, and OpenStack can also help in that with respect to configuration. This is another area where if one could configure more fine-grained control with respect to security of endpoints, this will be helpful for IoT devices also. So I'm going to address some of these concerns and how OpenStack can actually help, since this is an emerging technology. IoT devices are going to be like a $17 trillion technology. It's going to be big. So I think this is something that could be mutually beneficial to both. I talked to several some project leads and several technical guys who are contributing to OpenStack, and they all expressed varied level of interest, and they definitely say this is something OpenStack should look into. IoT devices' characteristics are very varied. Some of them could be like regular device, some of them could be very low powered, and some of them cannot spend that much energy at any given instance, so which limits how much of encryption, that kind of stuff they could do. So IoT devices also require a lot of endpoint trust, because if one doesn't know which device they are talking to, it could create a lot of issues. So IoT devices also can be passive and active, like RFID devices. They are passive. So how one can integrate into OpenStack infrastructure is itself an interesting question. So proliferation of devices are also too many. And another characteristic things about IoT devices is they could generate a lot of data. Actually, one would be surprised the amount of data the IoT devices can generate. It also falls very well within the way that OpenStack does overlay mechanisms for networking. So this is another thing where IoT devices lends themselves to be managed by OpenStack if OpenStack could be adapted to it. And there's also a lot of machine-to-machine interaction in IoT devices. And this is just the OpenStack, the architecture I'm flashing because this doesn't have all the components. I picked some major ones like, compute, network, keystone. These are the things, components. I think it needs slight modifications. And even though OpenStack as such is modeled after the behavior of virtual machines, I think in a lot of ways, IoT devices, could be, one could argue it follows the similar model like VM. So as of today, people are using OpenStack to actually monitor IoT devices. One could go see that on the web. This is happening to a limited extent. And beyond this, people are writing serial mirror agents for every single IoT devices, and they're collecting, monitoring data, and they are putting it into the database. And the MongoDB, and they're using it for monitoring purposes. However, it could be used for a better data analytics of IoT devices. And I think that's basically where a real value of OpenStack will really come in. So the problem with just limiting it to serial mirror is the amount of data one can put in database in MongoDB with respect to serial mirror is limited. By design and architecture, serial mirror is supposed to sustain low data throughputs. And its relation to other components of OpenStack is also limited. It has got limited APIs, and sucking data out of it will be a challenge. So there is no clean mechanism to manage IoT devices in the OpenStack. So this is one thing I have been discussing with Nova guys and Neutron and several other team members. I even discussed some more with talking to the user communities, and they suggested there is a possibility of a work group here within OpenStack. So another thing is the main security component, Keystone. It does authentication as of today. There is no reason why it cannot do authentication for IoT devices. So this is another idea that I've been kicking around with people, and I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm in this aspect also. So I'm going to talk about some of the design aspects that we could consider within OpenStack to accommodate managing of IoT devices on a large scale. I think IoT devices could be considered as a compute device. Just like a VM is a compute device that we provision and load balance and do the lifecycle management. The same way one could argue that IoT is equivalent to power on is when IoT come into the purview of management of OpenStack. So I think there's a lot of analogy of IoT devices and the virtual machine. Second is IoT data need to be actually segregated, just like VM data. And I think Neutron can actually help in that aspect. And if Neutron could be configured to do encryption, because a lot of the IoT devices may not be able to encrypt on their own. So if Neutron can actually help with that, that'll also be helpful. And then the Keystone can certainly be leveraged and used to actually authenticate IoT devices. The Keystone, as it exists today, may need a slight modification. I'm not suggesting any major behavioral modifications of any of these components. I think with a little bit of thinking, these components could be very easily adapted to manage the IoT devices. So the regular architecture that we have here, IoT device could potentially be managed by Nova. Actually, I was talking to some people in Nova, and they said, well, we need to think whether virtual machines, the model that we have imagined for virtual machines, can also be applied to IoT devices. The more I talk to people, it seems like there is more similarity than the differences. And IoT device authentication can happen using Keystone itself. A network the neutron component could be slightly modified to configure various encryptions. So we don't have to redesign OpenStack. We can think through the existing components that we have to manage the IoT devices. I think it'll be a success story if we actually put some little energy into this. Thank you. That's about it.